Hi everyone! Viewers have requested me to make a full manual ranged rotation guide since after all I only use ranged in Runescape. But I'm not sure if this is something I am truly qualified to do because of the way I learned how to PvM. I guess sometimes I like to refer to myself as the amateur PvMer. As the title of the video suggests, instead I will be telling my story on how I learned full manual ranged on Runescape. This isn't a full guide about learning full manual, but I will provide some insight about it, so hopefully some parts of it will either be interesting or at least help you try to use full manual in the future. To start out the backstory, you would think I learned Revolution first, and then learned full manual with ability queuing on, but that's not how it went for me. I actually learned full manual first, before I learned about the existence of Revolution. Till this day, Revolution is just too confusing for me and I just suck at it when it comes to bossing, and I only use it for Slayer. From 2013 all the way to around 2018 to 2019, I would full manual everything, quest bosses, Slayer, and even PvP. Back when I was going for 99 combat stats, I would prioritize doing things like fragmentation shock and walking under ranged targets to double the damage, or I would bind them to delay their counterattack, and if I kill the target, I don't get counterattack. All these little small habits added up to the reduced amount of banking time. I would always make it my goal to stay at least an hour without banking. I'm so used to full manual to a point where Necro was first released, I manually put my auto attack in my action bar and I would manually use it because it just felt too weird not to do that. RuneScape is one of those few action bar games where I have to be careful about how much combat I do. If I was to reduce the amount of PvM to 1 hour a day, in a few weeks, I have to take a break from PvM. The reason being is that my left hand would start to feel cold, numb, and painful. As a result of this, I eventually learned about hand stretches and better ergonomics. Around 2018 to 2019, someone eventually told me, you know there's something called Revolution, right? And now I can do Slayer with Revolution without breaking my left hand. As my first advice to full manual, if you're thinking about getting into full manual, my first important advice is to make sure you learn about hand stretches and better ergonomics and don't overexert yourself or you'll end up like my left hand. My left hand is one of the main reasons I cannot stand more switchscape. Let's now talk about how I got into PvM in 2021. At some point, after hours of Slayer, even up until 200 mil Slayer, I finally decided and gave in and decided to get into bossing. The first place I chose to learn PvM is Elite Dungeon 2. I have like 0 boss kills everywhere else including 82. This was in 2021, so at that time, crossbows were still superior to bows because of Percurmial bolts. I only had a Seren Godbow, 1 EOF, and full ceramic armor with not a lot of PvM upgrades. There also wasn't quality of life things like passive Ring of Vigour, so I needed both a Plant of Feet switch and a Ring of Vigour switch. Given my problems with my left hand, this was a terrible time. I also used to use a vertical action bar UI, which was very brilliant for PvMing. The problem I fell into is that I was trying to learn boss mechanics, DPS, the feel of PvM, and switches all at the same time. Look at my 154th time today at Blackstone Dragon compared to before, 10 minutes. After months of improving my time in PvM, let's talk about specific habits, or I guess most players call it, rotations in the game. My core habit of mine is using Death Swiftness right away and drinking an immediate adrenaline pot. My first habit I maintain till this day is if the target is 4x4 or 5x5, I prioritize getting 2 SGB special attacks within 1 Death Swiftness. I will use SGB right away after the Death Swiftness and make sure I use it when it's off cooldown again. Then I will follow that up with making sure I also get 2 rapid fires and 2 snapshots and 1 Death Swiftness too. If they are on cooldown or not enough adrenaline, then I use whatever basics including beads if I must until I do. For 3x3 targets like Ambassador, the double SGB thing is less prioritized as I sometimes find little differences. But what if the target isn't that big? Then the second habit of mine would be to not include the Seren Godbow special attack, and I just focus on the goal of 2 rapid fires and 2 snapshots and 1 Death Swiftness. You probably could get away with substituting that with Samurai Bolt EOF or Dark Bolt EOF, but I won't get into that as I consider that stepping too much into Switchscape. Once I got both the Last Guardian, I simply replaced the SGB spec with both the Last Guardian spec, then also use the both Last Guardian spec whenever I have too much adrenaline to dump while waiting for rapid fire and snapshot. With ECB spec, I developed a third habit of mine. If the boss is a boss where I feel I am comfortable enough to use the spec, then I'll try to keep the spec up during the double SGBs and rapid fires for big extra damage. With Elite Dracolich, this habit now includes prioritizing rapid fire followed up with strong abilities like SGB, Snapshot, Great Ricochet, or Bow the Last Guardian. I use this specifically for hard mode Vorkath to make sure I get that Ice Spice mechanic skip. But a problem I found with this is if you can use ECB, then I'd rather just use habit number 3. Why? Well, I'm unable to get 2 SGBs and 1 Death Swiftness. There's just not enough time. Outside of Death Swiftness, well, pretty much sums up to random abilities, go! Then I choose whether to build Desperate Arrow stacks for Incendiary or for a Death Swiftness alone. I like to do Rapid Fire and then Grit Go while using Desperate Arrows just to be sure I get those 5 stacks, until I can use Death Swiftness at the right time. I also do not like using things like stalling Incendiary Shot to use both Incendiary and Death Swiftness at the same time at the start of the fight, or placing dummies down to build stacks before the boss fight. First, that takes time, and second, it felt very unnatural to me. Like that's just not something a player that doesn't read anything about the game can just figure out from in-game tooltips. It's not like I'm trying to break world records or anything. That's just not what I do to have fun. What about specific rotations? Let's now get into the dumpster fire of what we call learning rotations. Now, before I get into that, I want to remind all of you that this is my story, and I am sharing specifically my journey into PvM. The resources, guides like PvM Me are great resources with lots of effort put into it, and I'm sure it has helped a lot of players get into PvM. These next sessions are going to sound a bit cynical when it comes to learning rotations, so please bear with me. Okay, now let me begin to say that I never truly learned what we call rotations in the game. Like other games with ability bars, the only thing I do is look at my action bar and my adrenaline bar and see what abilities are on cooldown and which are not, and I just click on random buttons and hope something works, and keep it more dynamic than robotic, if that makes any sense. Maybe I'm doing a rotation, but it's something I do subconsciously rather than something I closely study and replicate. Dummy DPS tests also did not work out for me. How I performed on a dummy does not account for the pressure from the bosses and the ability to survive against the boss at the same time. I learned better by practicing at an actual boss and also getting used to the boss mechanics. As I described when talking about habits, I have an idea on what goals to prioritize during a Death Swiftness, but it doesn't mean I have to follow the same exact order to achieve those priorities. Like a Starland, for example, I actually don't start the fight with Death Swiftness, and instead save my adrenaline to hurt the boss immediately before my damage gets significantly reduced until the black hole. Or hard mode Vorkath, I force myself to use Limitless to make sure I do enough damage to skip the Ice Spikes mechanic, even if what I did does not follow the most optimal rotation guides out there. Whenever I read rotation guides back as a full Manual PvM initiate, it always felt like that this is the best rotation, and anything else you do that doesn't follow it is a skill issue. Combined with peer pressure with very high expectations, my attempts to follow this only came with getting killed by something in between and then complaining to myself that I died doing the meta way. Skill issue, am I right? So I just said screw it. I threw every rotation guide knowledge out of my head, and now the pressure to follow them is gone. I can now focus on boss mechanics and figure out the quote-unquote rotation naturally, where interruptions no longer screw me over because of how flexible it is now. On the subject of specifics, let me introduce the Tendril Problem. If you're wondering what I'm talking about, it's this ability called Shadow Tendrils. Other styles except Necromancy will have their own tendrils. To sum it up, you do damage but it also hurts you. Back in the day, I would be pressured by other people, guides, rotation guides to use tendrils. Use tendrils in this rotation because it's high DPS and that's the only thing that matters. Right, except it also hurts you. Tell this to a PvM veteran, sure, not a problem. Telling this to a complete PvM initiate learning PvM, as I used to be one, all I can tell you is using this is not very encouraging, as I've only seen death, high death costs back then too. What I was never told is when/how to use it properly without getting myself killed.
Just use Soul Split and you'll heal it back. Just use Soul Split and you'll heal it back. Just use Soul Split, you're gonna heal it back anyways. Just use Soul Split, you're gonna heal it back!
Shout out to Flores Foy for voicing the imitation of the advice I received on how to use tendrils. And I think that's one of my major problems with following rotational guides that included tendrils. The pressure to must do it in this order can be overwhelming, even if the timing is just wrong for that boss. When I gave up learning rotation order, I just said I'll use it whenever I feel it's the right time. What I eventually told myself about Tendril is if I'm not in the middle of a dangerous situation that could kill me if I use Tendrils, and at least I have 5k HP or more, then I can use it without worrying about dying in the future. On the subject of high risk, high damage abilities, let's also talk about the Reckless Aura problem. In case you don't know, just think of it as an aura that boosts your damage but also makes you take more damage. If you tell a PvM veteran to use Reckless Aura because it's good DPS, yeah, no problem. I'm not here to say they're wrong because that's not the point I'm trying to make. But when I was told this as a PvM initiate to use Reckless Aura when there are just many more beginner-friendly auras to choose from, it's just awful when I look back. I remember I died more often using this Reckless Aura, and I didn't even get faster times as somebody said it would. As soon as I switched to Dark Magic, I actually got a better PR, despite the math not adding up there. Although I think it's because I was still figuring out the boss mechanics, so I'm actually punished less for screwing up. Telling me to take more damage when I'm uncomfortable with the mechanics was just a terrible experience for me. In every unfamiliar boss, I will never ever use Reckless Aura to begin with. Eventually, I was able to comfortably use Reckless Aura, and then my times improved after getting comfortable with the boss. This was all before I started getting comfortable with Inspiration Aura when they added both the Last Guardian, and I haven't touched Reckless Aura since then. So what's the takeaway from this? I'm not saying Tendrils and Reckless Aura are bad choices, nor am I saying rotation guides are bad either. In fact, I'd say rotation guides are very good because there are people out there that find it extremely helpful, which is great. Although they did not work for me, I did find value in focusing on figuring out the boss mechanics and allow my DPS be a secondary worry. If rotations were difficult to mimic like it was for me, you could try to simplify rotations into specific goals to achieve during a Death Swiftness rather than a set rotation. At least that's what worked for me. I think this is why I enjoyed hard mode broadcast because of how adaptable and dynamic it is. I am always making different choices in the choice of abilities I use depending on how the kill is going. That isn't to say this boss is a good design because it really isn't, but it's a perfect example of how flexibility rather than a specific rotation to follow has made me enjoy bossing more. Especially when you have to factor in crit chances and desperate arrows, you can't simply rely on a specific order every time. Maybe many of you watching this video are already like me, or not at all, or you're probably thinking this whole video is just me talking out of my bum. One thing I felt for sure is I avoided PvM for a long time because there's just too much expectations on dealing high damage, but not enough expectations on how to handle a boss mechanic. Telling me to follow this DPS rotation as the solution to a Starland doesn't work if I had no idea my damage was being significantly reduced when the Astral Rain appeared. Boss guides that talk about mechanics are great too, but like everything in life, a guide is a guide, but most value comes from trying to do it. Who cares if your damage is not as high as someone else's? My starting time used to be over 2 minutes, and I missed the fun I had in figuring out the boss rather than bursting it down into nothing in 40 seconds. Phew. Still with me? Let me know what you think about this in the comments. We're done about this. Moving on. If you have been following my channel for a while, some of you might have noticed I use my mouse to do my arrow switches, food eating, and EOF switches. It does seem weird, but it has worked out for me. Remember the issue I had on my left hand? There's only so much I can do with my left hand, and the last thing I want to do is hurt my right hand too. That's why I use the mouse, because it's easier for me to throw the bomb, switch, and eat than it is to use my left hand to try to do damage at the same time. That's also why I dislike having too many switches, and one of the primary reasons for why I am not a fan of switching too much in a short time. But one benefit of this is that moving while using abilities is one of the first things I am super used to. The journey in learning PvM has been both a tough and interesting experience for me. Although I started my journey with already understanding how full manual feels, the boss experience itself was a very fun, chaotic one. Although there are many bosses I have yet to challenge due to skill issues with memory, prayer flicking, or motivation, I'm hoping the upcoming combat achievements will give me that motivation to tackle them. So if you're looking to get into full manual ranged, here are some tips for you. First one, obviously, is to be prepared to take breaks, do some hand stretches, and have good ergonomics. If you're just getting into full manual and have no clue about how it feels to use it, I recommend you start this slow in something as simple as Slayer tasks without using any ultimate boost like Death Swiftness, just to get the feel for movement, using abilities, and ability queue. Once you are comfortable with it and have some understanding on how it works, then I encourage you to try the map bosses you are comfortable with and take it slow. Remember, you don't have to follow a very specific order if that's something you struggle in. Set your goals as getting these abilities off after using Death Swiftness depending on your target and try to achieve them. If you have zero boss knowledge like I did when I started, I encourage you to focus more on getting comfortable with the boss mechanics first and have your full manual DPS be a slow secondary process. It didn't take me a day to become comfortable with PvM, baby steps. Jagex has also added many quality of life changes like the Bone Shield, Ring of Vigour passive, greater Death Swiftness, and more. The time to learn full manual is much better than 3 years ago. Last but not least, I know it might seem like the expectations are very high when you compare your times to others. I feel it's important to say that everyone starts somewhere, and the most important part is that you get the kill and the drop, no matter how slow or fast it was. Stop comparing yourself with others if it's actually discouraging you, and most importantly, as long as you are having fun, who cares if your time is slower than someone else? If following a rotation is something you enjoy, then that's absolutely awesome. Thank you for listening to my story on how I learned full manual range and how I got to where I am today. If you enjoy range content, feel free to subscribe. If you got any topics on range you would like me to cover, feel free to drop them in the comments below. Remember that this is my own experiences and it will most likely be different from yours. Thank you, and bye bye.